Many of us say it's dying we fear, not death. Ron Delbane, nationally known spiritual director and teacher based in Birmingham, Alabama, teaches us that God is present in dying as in living. Knowing this, we can embrace the dying process and be fully there for each other.
In the process of death and dying, it's not uncommon to experience moments for which there are no words. Some people are more aware of these moments than others. Some are afraid of them. Some talk about sensing God's presence. To explore the sacred in death and dying is to be alert to the holy, to be aware of those sacred moments, and to look for the deeper meaning. Saying goodbye is not generally an easy thing to do in our culture. There are many ways to say goodbye. It may be a wave of the hand, it may be a hug, it may be a touch on the arm or on the cheek, or it may be writing a letter. We even use different words and phrases. We may say very clearly and directly, "Goodbye, I will miss you." Or we may say, "I'll see you again sometime." Or even, let's not even say goodbye. Saying goodbye is even more difficult when the person to whom you're saying goodbye is someone you love, and especially when that person you love is dying. Because this final act of closure is so influenced by our personal and family and cultural background, it's important that each person say goodbye in their own way.
And it was difficult to say goodbye to my father. I did it, but I didn't really say that I had done it with him. He said something to me about sometimes people are a little further down the road than others. And when he said that, I knew that that was what he was saying. And so I could kind of amen that and say, yes, I understand that. And that was as close as we got to really saying those words, but it seemed to be enough.
I just take a book and I just spend a couple hours sitting next to her, you know. And then when she would be awake, she'd be concerned that I was wasting my day, and I'd just say, "Mom, this is what I want to do," you know. And I just, depending on, she slept, you know, 90% of the day, but to me that was important to have that time with her and to know that it was final, I guess, to really close out.
The first time I said goodbye, it was really hard. But then after that, it wasn't as hard. What was hard was being attentive to the fact that not to discount the goodbye because, well, 3 years ago I said goodbye and everyone said Grandpa's not going to live another year, and so you're not attentive to that saying goodbye.
In those special moments of closure with someone we love, it is not easy to admit that we are saying goodbye, or to be attentive to our goodbyes, or sometimes to even know what to say. In the immediacy of those moments, sometimes, however, we are able to say things that we had never said before, or to experience things that we've never experienced before. Let's listen as Peggy talks about how she said goodbye to her brother, and how Patrick related to his friend.
When I realized that he was dying, I told him that I loved him, which is something that we really didn't say a lot in our family. I told him that I loved him, and I believed that he heard me, you know, and kind of gave a little wink, and he died.
At one point on Saturday, Lehib was basically in a coma and was not really responding, except when you screamed really loudly at him. So we would bring his friends in. We would sit with them for a while. Then we would leave and allow them the opportunity to say their goodbye. And then we would come back and talk with them about Lee and what he had done and try to help them understand that he was still here and he would still respond. And we would say, talk to Lee. Tell him what you want to tell him.
There are many ways of exploring the sacred in death and dying in the process of saying goodbye. In Patrick's story of his friend Lee, we see how the friends were taken more deeply into a process of communication. But what happens when communication is only a one-way street? It's important to say goodbye to people who are in comas or in situations where we don't think that they are responsive to what we might say. For instance, John shares how he was able to say goodbye to his friend Joe.
I know, Joe, that you're in a coma, that your mind and your body are not functioning properly. But my deep conviction is that your spirit is alive and well, and that you know everything that's going on here, and that's the part of you that I'm addressing. I want to thank you, first of all, for being my friend for about 20 years. And then I want to thank you for this opportunity to come and sing for you these beautiful songs of faith. And I just want you to know that I'm going to miss you, but I bid you farewell, and I'll see you again. Well, when I left and rode back up the highway, I thought, I never said anything like that before. I never felt it before. I mean, it just came to me that the spirit is eternal. It doesn't die and doesn't wither just because the body withers.
John's story reminds me of the many times that I've been asked, what do you do when someone's in a coma? What do you tell their families? Here are some things I found helpful. Assume that the person hears everything you're saying. So carry on normal conversation. Stay in touch. Physically touch the person as you did when they were able to be communicative. Tell stories. Tell about those events and places where you've been and enjoyed yourself. Do routine things. Things that the person had enjoyed doing. For example, if they enjoyed reading the newspaper, then read the newspaper to them. If they enjoyed reading the scripture, then read the scriptures to them. That reminds me, after I'd given a seminar on this topic in Arizona, I received a letter from a hospital chaplain. He wrote, Sylvia was a patient who'd been comatose for a long time, non-communicative. Late one afternoon when I came to visit Sylvia, her daughter was there reading the scriptures to her. She had told me that her mother would sit for hours reading the Bible. She deferred to me and handed me the Bible to read, and I said that her mother would probably want to hear the scriptures from her own daughter. So she continued to read as I sat with them. She was reading the 11th chapter of John, where Jesus and Martha are talking about the risen life, and Jesus asks Martha, "Do you believe this?" At that very moment, Sylvia said clearly and in a strong voice, "Yes." That was her only word. We were both stunned. Later that evening, Sylvia died. That was almost a perfect ending. But not all deaths are perfect endings. Sometimes there is the phone call that tells us about the sudden death. I remember a time when I received a phone call like that. It's not easy to deal with sudden deaths. What are some ways that we may find helpful to deal with the sudden death experience?
To me, to be able to tell those people that in some mysterious way that we cannot understand or explain, that we are still in communion with those people who have left us through death, and that we can still ask forgiveness. We can still say goodbye.
For the next month or so, every time during Eucharist, I'd be totally overwhelmed by his presence. It's like I wasn't thinking about it or looking for it, but when I would feel that, just tears would just roll. It's like it would just, And so now that I look back, I think there was a communication happening, and that was our, maybe perhaps that's the way of saying goodbye.
When you can't say goodbye before one's death, then I try to help people envision saying goodbye for a longer period of time. And we do some things. For instance, there are many shade trees at Birmingham Southern College that have been planted and nurtured and grown in honor and memory of someone. Sometimes I like to take students around and say, this is the tree for Steve, this is the tree for Diane, this is the tree.
In situations of sudden death, there is often the if only question. If only I had been there to say goodbye. If only I'd been able to ask forgiveness. If only, if only. Over the years of hearing people tell me their stories about if only times, I've heard some that I would like to share with you. Ways that people have found helpful. Phil told me about his best friend Bill, who died suddenly. Said it dawned on me one day at my office as I saw a picture of the two of us together on a trip that we were still connected. I sat down at my desk, looked at Bill in the picture, and said my goodbye. Something personal, a personal belonging, is sometimes helpful. Margaret told me how she put on her mother's ring that her mother had given her. That began a process of her forgiveness of her mother. When Sandy's grandpa died, she found that sitting across from her grandpa's favorite chair provided her an opportunity to imagine him there and to talk about some wonderful times that they had had. It was her way of being able to say goodbye. Billy found that after his brother died, he went to the cemetery, was able to sit at the grave, cry, and talk about things that he'd always wanted to tell his brother. John found that a letter was very helpful. He told me that he and his wife Sarah had often written little notes to one another, putting them under their pillows, hiding them in briefcases, for example. That after Sarah died, he sat at the kitchen table and said for weeks on end, I just wrote her little notes and letters, telling her all the things that I didn't have a chance to tell her before she died. There are many ways to say goodbye. What ways do you say goodbye to your family and to people whom you love? Our heritage or our religion often provide more formal ways of saying goodbye. We call these rituals for passage. Our religion may provide a graveside ceremony or an evening of prayer. Special customs for grieving and gatherings may rise out of our heritage, our culture, our ethnic background. Sometimes rituals are creative and rise out of the moment. Other times they are very simple. Rituals help in this final act of closure.
When we get ready to take a child off of life support, we ask the family if they would like to be back there and hold their child before we turn the ventilators off and take the tubes out. And most of the time the families say they want to be there. And to give them as much privacy as we can, we pull this heavy, large curtain around. For me, that's a real powerful image. I'm often reminded of the stories of, on the Day of the Atonement, the high priest walking back behind the curtain to be in the Holy of Holies. And that's what it feels like to me with families at that time, is that's a very holy and a very sacred moment with them. There's no pretense that families have, I mean, they are grieving, and they're not pretending. And oftentimes they'll ask for some special ritual. Usually it's just a prayer.
Do you remember a time when you walked behind a curtain? There is sometimes a literal sense of walking behind a curtain into a sacred space. I remember being with a family whose young teenage daughter had just died. And the mother said very softly, "I want to wash her. Someone else washed her when she was born into this world. I want to wash her since she was born into another world." And sometimes those moments are so sacred, I've often felt like I didn't belong there. And yet at the same time, I knew that it was important for me to support and to encourage the ritual. And so I simply said, what a beautiful ritual that would be for you as a mother with her daughter. But sometimes people are not able to walk behind that curtain into a sacred space. Sometimes there's a struggle. Peggy talks about such a struggle.
And in talking to the family member, I discovered that this person wasn't ready to let go. That the patient was ready, but this person, and the struggle that was coming from the patient was not that the patient was not ready to go, it was holding on because of the loved one, was saying, just hold on, don't give up.
Rituals often help resolve the struggle, but sometimes loved ones are not ready to give up the struggle. Sometimes the struggle comes from the patient, yearning to create a ritual that will express the meaning of this special moment. I remember Jake, his wife Betty, their 6 children and their family. Jake was in a hospital bed surrounded by 24 people keeping the death watch there in their small living room in rural Florida. Jake was tossing and turning and mumbling to Betty. She turned and said, "He wants to be in his own bed." Some of the children, without a word, picked him up, carried him upstairs with everyone following, and laid him in the big bed. He settled in, looked around at everybody, gave a sigh, and died. The silence was broken by Betty, who spoke softly. "Every one of you children was conceived and born in this bed. Your daddy was conceived and born in this bed. I guess he wanted to end up where he started." Some people ask for particular rituals. And these rituals are sometimes from their heritage or from their religion. Other times, we have to help people discern what ritual will best express what they are experiencing.
Some people believe in saying the Shema if they feel that their time is near. The Shema being Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. A cry of affirmation, really, as a goodbye. They might say that. Perhaps someone would stand beside them and help them say that, hold their hand, ask them if there's something else they'd want to say.
And she opened the door of a room I'd never been in before and ushered me into this room. And this room, the man's name was Mr. White. Now, I'd never met Mr. White. And she ushered me into the room and we pushed me on up to the bed. And Mr. White had died. And there he was. They had washed him and cleaned him up and laid him out on the bed. And she kept propelling me over to the edge of the bed. And she stood on one side and I was on the other. And she went over and smoothed his forehead and told me how handsome he looked, and didn't he look beautiful? And hadn't they done a great job cleaning him up? And Well, I had never confronted a person that had died before. So I was standing there with all kind of mixed feelings going on inside of me. And she kept saying these things about him and talking about him. And I knew she wanted something out of me. But in my state, I had no idea what she wanted me to do. So that afternoon when I finished at the nursing home, I stopped by a friend's office and went in and talked with her. And I told her the whole story, and I said, what did she want? What did I miss? And she said, well, Allison, she wanted you to pray with her. And I thought, of course. She wanted me to pray about his life and to pray with her about him.
Rituals are so important. Sometimes we're able to do them ourselves. Other times we need someone else to help us move more deeply into what we're experiencing. Sometimes we even find ourselves caught in a jumble of thoughts, feelings, and emotions. In Allison's story, the nurse's words and actions were not enough. To take some water or a washcloth and smooth Mr. White's forehead might have been in keeping with the nurse's smoothing of his hair. Reminds me, I met with a grandfather of a friend of mine. He was dying in the hospital. I didn't know him, but as I was there visiting, I heard him mumbling. And his daughter said, oh, that's the Lord's Prayer in German. He's German, you know, and that was his favorite childhood prayer. I asked, do you know the prayer in German? She said, no. So I contacted someone at the university and asked them to write out the prayer in German so that the family would be able to share it with him. I took it back. The daughter shared with me later how when they got together and prayed the prayer with him, how his lips would move. And they had a sense of sharing with him in a very deep way. So many times those rituals that we learned as children become important for us. And rituals are important not only for the person who's dying, but also for the survivors and the friends in the larger circle.
He picked music, he picked the comforter set that he loved, he picked the aftershave, he picked the way he wanted his hair, everything. He picked the scriptures that he wanted us to read. I noticed that everybody had their own ritual with Lee, and because of his relationship with them. And Lee always respected his friends and loved to have fun with his friends and didn't want people to be crying all the time about him. But you are supposed to cry at least a little bit. That was Lee's instructions.
Lee not only planned some of his own rituals for passage, but he gave some guidelines to his friends to help them with their rituals of passage and to enter more into the sacred space. Sometimes people are not able to create their own personal rites of passage, and so they rely upon those of their heritage or their religion.
After someone has died, usually at graveside, families are invited to throw dirt on the grave with a shovel as a saying goodbye. That's hard to do for a lot of people. But I think it's a good way to say goodbye. It's a final, it's an ending, a closure.
In various cultures and faith traditions, throughout the ages, rituals have grown up to help people in that time of final closure and to be able to say their goodbyes. There are many ways to say goodbye, and there are many rituals that we use in being able to say goodbye. What rituals do you or your family or your religious tradition use in saying goodbye?